racist captain attacked Barack and Michelle Obama on a cruise ship, unaware that his actions would lead to shocking consequences. What happened next left everyone stunned. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The sun was setting over the bustling harbor as Barack and Michelle Obama stepped out of their black SUV, their luggage carefully arranged by their driver. The scene before them was breathtaking. A gleaming cruise ship, its hull painted a pristine white, towered above the docks like a floating palace. Rows of shimmering lights ran along its decks, glowing softly against the evening sky. It was a sight designed to inspire awe, promising luxury and serenity for all who boarded. For Barack and Michelle, this was meant to be a long-awaited escape from the unrelenting pressures of public life. A time to unwind, reconnect, and enjoy a peaceful journey across the turquoise waters of the Caribbean. As they approached the embarkation area, they noticed how warmly other guests were greeted by staff in crisp uniforms. Smiles, handshakes, and welcoming words filled the air, creating an atmosphere of festive anticipation. Yet, when their turn came, the energy shifted. The uniformed crew member who took their passports hesitated briefly, her polished smile faltering for the smallest fraction of a second. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Michelle noticed. The young woman's eyes darted to a nearby supervisor, who gave a barely discernible nod before stepping forward himself. "Welcome aboard the Elysium, Mr. and Mrs. Obama," he said, his tone measured, almost mechanical. He extended a hand, but his grip lacked warmth, and his gaze flicked away too quickly, as if avoiding prolonged eye contact. "Thank you," Barack replied, his voice calm, though a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. The supervisor gestured to another crew member, who appeared slightly hesitant as she reached for their luggage. Nearby, other passengers were being ushered aboard with lively conversation and enthusiastic attention. A sense of unease began to settle over Michelle. She glanced at Barack, who gave her a reassuring smile, as if to say, "Let's not make assumptions just yet." Once aboard, they were struck by the ship's grandeur. The Elysium was nothing short of spectacular. A floating city with gilded staircases, sparkling chandeliers, and sprawling decks that offered panoramic views of the sea. Michelle had to admit, the ambiance was stunning. For a moment, she allowed herself to relax, letting the excitement of the journey replace the faint discomfort she had felt at the dock. Their check-in at the reception desk, however, reignited her unease. The receptionist, a young man with perfectly styled hair and a stiffly polite demeanor, took an uncomfortably long time verifying their reservation. He seemed distracted, glancing frequently at his computer screen and then at a colleague who whispered something inaudible before quickly walking away. "I'm sorry for the delay," the receptionist finally said, handing over their keycards with an apologetic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It seems there was a mix-up with the room assignments. You've been placed in one of our premium suites, but it doesn't have the ocean view you originally requested. We'll do our best to rectify this as soon as possible." Michelle's brow furrowed. "Our booking was for an ocean view suite. Are you saying it's unavailable?" The receptionist nodded, his demeanor remaining polite but detached. "Unfortunately, yes, but we assure you the suite you've been assigned is of the highest quality." Barack placed a calming hand on Michelle's arm before she could press further. "Thank you," he said, his tone measured. "We appreciate your help." As they were escorted to their suite, the unease only deepened. Other guests they passed in the hallways greeted them with a mix of curiosity and reserved politeness, their eyes lingering just a moment too long. When they reached their room, the promised premium suite was tastefully decorated but noticeably less opulent than the ocean view accommodations they had seen in the promotional materials. The view through the window revealed not the endless expanse of the sea, but a modest deck area partially obscured by lifeboats. "Well," Michelle said, sinking onto the edge of the bed and attempting a smile, "this isn't exactly what I had in mind for luxury." Barack chuckled softly, sitting beside her. "Let's not jump to conclusions. It's just the first day. We'll sort it out tomorrow. Still, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The subtle cues, the hesitant smiles, the whispered conversations, the prolonged check-in painted a picture that she couldn't ignore. Later that evening, they ventured out to explore the ship. The main dining hall was magnificent, with vaulted ceilings and a grand piano providing soft background music. But even as they took in the splendor of their surroundings, Michelle couldn't help but feel that the unease from earlier in the day had not faded, it had only just begun. The suite was described as being of the highest quality, but as Michelle and Barack Obama entered, the unease in Michelle's chest only deepened. Barack placed a calming hand on Michelle's arm before she could press further. "Thank you," he said, his tone measured. "We appreciate your help." As they were escorted to their suite, the discomfort lingered. Other guests they passed in the hallways greeted them with a mix of curiosity and reserved politeness, their eyes lingering just a moment too long. There was no outright hostility, yet something about the way people regarded them felt different, almost calculated. When they finally reached their room, Michelle took in the space with a discerning eye. It was tastefully decorated, with plush furnishings and elegant touches, but something was missing. It was noticeably less opulent than the ocean view accommodations they had seen in the promotional materials. Instead of a stunning view of the endless sea, their window faced a modest deck area, partially obstructed by lifeboats. "Well," Michelle said, sinking onto the edge of the bed, attempting a smile, "this isn't exactly what I had in mind for luxury." Barack chuckled softly, sitting beside her. "Let's not jump to conclusions. It's just the first day. We'll sort it out tomorrow." Still, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The subtle cues, the hesitant smiles, the whispered conversations, the prolonged check-in, all painted a picture she couldn't ignore. Later that evening, they ventured out to explore the ship. The Elysium was breathtaking, its grandeur undeniable. The main dining hall was a magnificent space with vaulted ceilings and a grand piano providing soft background music. The ambiance should have been relaxing, yet Michelle couldn't ignore the peculiar energy in the air. They were directed to a table near the back, far from the panoramic windows where other guests dined while enjoying the view of the sea. Their waiter, a young man with an odd smile, took their orders quickly and disappeared without offering the warmth or small talk that seemed customary at the other tables. Michelle watched how efficiently the staff catered to the other diners, refilling glasses, delivering meals promptly, and engaging in cheerful conversation. At their table, however, the service was slow and impersonal. When their meals finally arrived, the presentation was impeccable, but the delay was noticeable. Barack remained composed throughout the evening, offering gentle reassurances whenever Michelle voiced her observations. "Let's see how tomorrow goes," he said. "It might just be a coincidence." But Michelle wasn't so sure. As they returned to their suite, the ship's hallways were quieter, the vibrant energy they had witnessed earlier now feeling distant. Michelle lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's events in her mind. The feeling that they were being treated differently was no longer a vague suspicion. It was becoming an undeniable reality. The first day on the Elysium had ended, but Michelle knew the journey ahead would not be the carefree escape they had envisioned. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the suite's modest window as Michelle stirred from a restless sleep. She glanced at Barack, still sleeping peacefully, and sighed quietly. She wanted to believe his optimism, to think that the oddities they had experienced were just coincidence or poor management. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. By the time they made their way to the breakfast deck, the ship was alive with activity. Guests mingled near the buffet, the clinking of glasses and silverware blending with the low hum of conversation. The deck overlooked the ocean, a dazzling expanse of turquoise stretching to the horizon. It should have been a relaxing start to the day, yet Michelle immediately noticed the same patterns of behavior that had unsettled her the night before. As they approached the buffet, a server intercepted them. His smile was polite, but it felt forced. His body language was stiff. "Good morning," he said, gesturing toward the nearest table. "I'll bring your coffee shortly." They took their seats, and Michelle's eyes swept the room. Nearby tables were filled with guests who were being personally attended to by staff, receiving warm smiles and engaging conversation. Yet she and Barack were seated at the far edge of the deck, their table partially obscured by a large planter. Minutes ticked by without any sign of the promised coffee. Michelle tapped her fingers on the table, her patience wearing thin. "I'll get it myself," she said, rising from her chair. Barack reached out to stop her. "Let's give it a little more time. Maybe they're just busy." Michelle gave him a skeptical look but sat back down. Moments later, their coffee arrived, along with plates of food that looked hastily prepared. Barack thanked the server, but Michelle couldn't help but notice the way the man avoided making eye contact as he hurried away. The morning didn't improve. A planned visit to the ship's spa turned into another exercise in frustration. Despite booking treatments in advance, they were told their reservations couldn't be found. Michelle's irritation boiled over when she overheard the receptionist whispering to a colleague. Though her voice was low, her dismissive tone was unmistakable. "Maybe they got confused with the booking process," the woman muttered, glancing in their direction. Barack stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "There seems to be some sort of misunderstanding. We have confirmation emails for these appointments." The receptionist looked flustered, her cheeks reddening. "I'm terribly sorry, sir. Let me check again." It took another 20 minutes, but their appointments were eventually reinstated. Still, the interaction left Michelle with a bitter taste in her mouth. As they sat in the relaxation lounge waiting for their treatments, she leaned toward Barack. "You can't tell me this is all just bad luck," she said quietly. "They're going out of their way to make us feel unwelcome." Barack met her gaze, his expression thoughtful. "I'm starting to see it too," he admitted. "But let's keep our composure. If we react too strongly, we'll give them exactly what they want." That evening, the tension reached a boiling point during dinner. The dining hall buzzed with laughter and conversation as other guests enjoyed their meals. Yet, at the Obama table, service was once again slow and inattentive. Their waiter, a young man with a nervous disposition, fumbled their order and brought the wrong dishes. Twice. Michelle's frustration peaked when she noticed how warmly he interacted with the table nearby, laughing and joking as he poured wine for an older couple. When he finally returned to their table, she couldn't hold back any longer. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp. The waiter froze, his face flushing. "No, ma'am," he stammered. "I'm very, sorry for the delays." Michelle leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "It doesn't seem like you're sorry. It seems like you don't want to serve us." Barack placed a hand on her arm, a silent plea for restraint. The waiter mumbled another apology before retreating to the kitchen. Michelle watched him go, her chest tight with anger. Across the room, the dining hall's grand doors opened, and Captain Andreen entered. His uniform was impeccable, his posture commanding as he surveyed the room. Guests greeted him warmly, some even rising from their tables to shake his hand. When he reached the Obama's table, however, his demeanor shifted. "Mr. and Mrs. Obama," he said, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth. "I trust you're enjoying your evening." Michelle met his gaze, unflinching. "We're trying to." The captain's lips curved into a thin smile. "If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to let my staff know." Before Michelle could respond, he turned and strode away, leaving behind a sense of icy dismissal. Something was very wrong. A planned visit to the ship's spa turned into yet another exercise in frustration. Despite having booked their treatments well in advance, Michelle and Barack Obama were told that their reservations couldn't be found. Michelle's irritation grew as she overheard the receptionist whispering to a colleague. Though the woman's voice was hushed, her tone was unmistakably dismissive. "Maybe they got confused with the booking process," the woman said, casting a glance in their direction. Barack, sensing Michelle's growing frustration, stepped forward. His voice was calm but firm. "There seems to be some sort of misunderstanding. We have confirmation emails for these appointments." The receptionist's face flushed as she scrambled to check again. "I'm terribly sorry, sir. Let me verify this right away." It took another 20 minutes, but eventually their appointments were reinstated. Still, the interaction left Michelle with a bitter taste in her mouth. As they sat in the relaxation lounge waiting for their treatments, Michelle leaned toward Barack and lowered her voice. "You can't tell me this is all just bad luck," she said quietly. "They're going out of their way to make us feel unwelcome." Barack met her gaze, his expression thoughtful. "I'm starting to see it too," he admitted. "But let's keep our composure. If we react too strongly, we'll give them exactly what they want." That evening, Michelle's frustration came to a boiling point during dinner. The dining hall was buzzing with laughter and conversation as guests enjoyed their meals, the atmosphere lively and elegant. Yet, at the Obama table, service was once again slow and inattentive. Their waiter, a young man with a nervous disposition, fumbled their order and brought the wrong dishes. Not once, but twice. Michelle's patience was wearing thin, but what truly pushed her over the edge was what she observed at the table nearby. The same waiter who seemed so flustered and distracted at their table was now laughing and joking as he poured wine for an older couple. His interactions were warm, his demeanor relaxed, and easygoing. When he finally returned to their table, Michelle couldn't hold back any longer. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp. The waiter froze, his face turning red. "No, ma'am," he stammered. "I'm very sorry for the delays." Michelle leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "It doesn't seem like you're sorry," she said evenly. "It seems like you don't want to serve us." Barack reached across the table and placed a gentle hand on her arm, a silent plea for restraint. The waiter mumbled another apology before retreating to the kitchen. Michelle watched him go, her chest tight with anger. Across the room, the dining hall's grand doors opened, and Captain Andreen entered. His uniform was immaculate, his posture commanding. Guests greeted him warmly, some even rising from their seats to shake his hand. But when he reached the Obama's table, his demeanor shifted. His face remained perfectly composed, but his expression was devoid of the warmth he had displayed moments ago. "Mr. and Mrs. Obama," he said smoothly, "I trust you're enjoying your evening." Michelle met his gaze, unflinching. "We're trying to," she replied coolly. The captain's lips curled into a thin smile. "If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to let my staff know." Before Michelle could respond, he turned and strode away, leaving behind an air of icy dismissal. Barack sighed, rubbing his temples. Michelle exhaled sharply, her patience nearly at its limit. "This is deliberate," she said, her voice low but firm. "They're making it clear. We don't belong here." Barack nodded. "I know," he admitted, "but we have to handle this carefully." The evening ended on an even more sour note when, on their way out of the dining hall, Michelle overheard a hushed conversation between two staff members near the exit. "They're so entitled," one of them muttered. "Just because they used to be important doesn't mean they are now." Michelle's stomach twisted. She glanced at Barack, who had already started walking toward the elevator. She caught up with him, her mind racing. This wasn't just poor service. It wasn't a series of unfortunate mistakes. This was intentional. A conversation between two staff members near the dining hall's exit caught Michelle's attention. Their voices were hushed, but their words were unmistakable. "They're so entitled," one of them muttered. "Just because they used to be important doesn't mean they are now." Michelle's stomach twisted. She glanced at Barack, who was already walking toward the elevator, his face unreadable. She quickened her pace to catch up, but her mind was racing. This was no longer just about subpar service. It was deliberate. Back in their suite, the tension was palpable. Michelle paced the room, her frustration spilling over. "We can't keep letting them treat us like this," she said, her voice taut with emotion. "We need to say something to someone who will actually listen." Barack sat on the edge of the bed, his expression thoughtful. "And Dreen isn't just the captain," he said. "He's the authority on this ship. If we escalate this, we need to be ready for whatever comes next." Michelle stopped pacing and turned to face him. "You think he's behind all of this?" Barack exhaled, running a hand over his chin. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think it's time we start paying closer attention." The night was restless for both of them. Even as exhaustion weighed on their bodies, their minds refused to quiet. The veneer of luxury on the Elysium was cracking, revealing something far more insidious beneath the surface. The following morning dawned with an eerie stillness that mirrored Michelle's unease. The soft sound of waves lapping against the hull should have been calming, but it only intensified the storm building inside her. She turned over to find Barack already awake, seated by the small writing desk, flipping through his phone with a furrowed brow. "Anything new?" she asked, her voice still heavy with sleep. Barack glanced up and gave her a tight, tired smile. "Nothing promising, just emails and a few updates on the markets," he said. "But I keep thinking about last night." Michelle nodded. The memory of their strained dinner, the captain's sharp-edged politeness, and the quiet but cutting remarks from the staff members still lingered. This wasn't about small inconveniences anymore. It was a pattern. A deliberate effort to exclude, to humiliate. "Today," Michelle said firmly, "we stopped giving them the benefit of the doubt." Barack leaned back in his chair and studied her. "I'm with you," he said, "but we have to be smart. If we push too hard, we'll look like we're overreacting, and that's exactly what they want." Michelle pressed her lips into a thin line. She understood his point, but the thought of enduring more of this treatment in silence was unbearable. "Let's watch," she said. "Pay attention to every detail, every interaction. If they think we're not noticing, they're wrong." After a slow, uncomfortable breakfast, marked by late service and lukewarm coffee, Michelle and Barack decided to spend the morning exploring the ship. They wanted to salvage what little enjoyment they could from their vacation. But as they wandered through the elegant hallways and sunlit decks, Michelle's sense of alienation only deepened. Near the main pool, they paused to admire the view. Sparkling blue water stretched endlessly, reflecting the clear sky above. The deck was bustling with guests lounging under umbrellas, sipping cocktails and chatting easily with the staff. Yet, as Michelle scanned the area, she couldn't ignore how the atmosphere subtly shifted when they stepped onto the deck. A group of women seated at a nearby table glanced their way. Their laughter faded into murmurs. One of them, an older woman in oversized sunglasses, tilted her head and whispered something to her companion, who looked directly at Michelle before quickly turning away. Michelle's shoulders tensed. "Did you see that?" Barack didn't need to ask what she meant. He had seen it too. "Let it go," he said quietly. "For now." But letting it go wasn't easy. Not when the pattern kept repeating itself. The incident at the pool was followed by a confrontation at the spa. Michelle and Barack had reserved chairs in advance, yet when they arrived they found that their seats had been reassigned to another couple. When Michelle pointed out the mistake, the attendant barely concealed her irritation. "There must have been an oversight," she said, not meeting Michelle's eyes. "You can take those seats by the entrance." Michelle's jaw tightened. The reassigned seats were in a less desirable location, far from the ocean view and directly next to the busy walkway. Barack placed a hand on her arm. "It's not worth it," he said quietly. Michelle exhaled sharply but didn't argue. She knew they were being dismissed. Again. By lunchtime, her patience was running dangerously thin. They decided to dine at one of the smaller restaurants on the upper deck, hoping for a quieter experience. Instead, they were met with more of the same. Their orders took twice as long as those of the other guests. Drinks were forgotten, the waiter's demeanor was stiff, his smile forced. And then, the final straw, Michelle watched as the same waiter who had taken their order, seemingly frazzled and overwhelmed, turned to another table and engaged in cheerful conversation. He laughed as he poured wine for an older couple, his posture relaxed and friendly. When he finally returned to their table, Michelle didn't hesitate. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp. The waiter froze. "No, ma'am," he stammered. I'm very sorry for the delays." Michelle leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "It doesn't seem like you're sorry," she said coolly. "It seems like you don't want to serve us." Barack placed a calming hand on her arm, a silent plea for restraint. The waiter mumbled another apology before retreating to the kitchen. Michelle watched him go, her chest tight with anger. She turned to Barack. "This is deliberate," she said. "They're making it clear we don't belong here." Barack nodded, his expression grave. "No," he said, "but we have to be careful about how we handle it." As Michelle looked around the room, at the stolen glances, the polite but cold smiles, she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about service. It was about something much bigger. Orders were delayed, and the strained smiles from the staff made it clear they were eager to move on to other tables. It was during this meal that Michelle finally reached her breaking point. The waiter, clearly flustered, placed Barack's plate on the table with a sharp clatter, causing sauce to spill onto the crisp linen tablecloth. He mumbled an apology, but his tone was flat, devoid of sincerity. Michelle put down her fork and leveled a firm gaze at him. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice steady but unmistakably sharp. The waiter froze. "No, ma'am," he said quickly. "Because it certainly feels like there's a problem," Michelle continued, her voice unwavering. "This isn't the first time we've been treated like an inconvenience, and I'm tired of pretending it's all in my head." Barack reached across the table and placed a calming hand over hers. "Let's take a breath," he said softly. But Michelle wasn't done. She turned her attention back to the waiter. "I want to speak with your manager." The waiter hesitated for a moment, then quickly retreated toward the kitchen. A few minutes later, Captain Andreen himself appeared. His posture was as stiff as his perfectly pressed uniform, and the practiced smile on his face didn't quite mask the glint of irritation in his eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Obama," he said smoothly, "I understand there's been a concern about your dining experience." Michelle stood, squaring her shoulders. "It's not just about dinner, Captain," she said firmly. "It's about the way we've been treated since we boarded this ship, and I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." The captain's smile barely wavered, but there was a flicker of something darker beneath it. "I'm sorry if you feel that way, Mrs. Obama," he said, his tone cool. "But I can assure you my staff is trained to provide the highest level of service to all our guests." "At your guests?" Michelle asked pointedly. Andreen's gaze hardened. "All of them." The tension in the air was thick, nearly suffocating. Barack rose from his seat and stepped closer to Michelle. "We'd appreciate it if you could make sure your staff understands that," he said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable weight. The captain nodded curtly. "Of course." But as he turned to leave, Michelle caught the briefest flicker of contempt in his expression. It sent a chill down her spine. Unable to shake the unease, Michelle took a solitary walk along one of the quieter decks. She needed time to think, to clear her head. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface rippling under the fading light. It should have felt freeing, but instead, it felt isolating. As she turned a corner, she heard voices, low, hushed, and unmistakably tense. She froze, pressing herself against the wall. "We need to handle this before it gets out of hand," a man's voice said. Michelle recognized it immediately. "Captain Andreen." "They're already making too much noise," another voice replied. "Then we make sure they can't anymore," Andreen said, his tone chillingly final. Michelle's breath caught in her throat. She stayed still, waiting until the voices faded before retreating quickly back to their suite, her heart pounding. Barack was sitting by the window when she burst in. "What happened?" he asked immediately, standing up. She told him everything. Barack's expression darkened. "We need to be careful," he said. "But we also need to be ready." They spent the rest of the night quietly packing their things, unsure of what the next day would bring, but certain that whatever it was, it wouldn't be good. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Michelle stirred awake. She sat up slowly, her mind still clouded by the events of the previous day. The weight of overhearing Captain Andreen's conversation lingered like a bitter aftertaste. She turned to see Barack already dressed, his face set in an expression she knew well, calm but intensely focused. "They're up to something," she said quietly, breaking the morning silence. Barack nodded, his eyes fixed on the small window overlooking the deck. "I don't like it either," he admitted. "We need to be prepared for whatever comes next." Michelle swung her legs out of bed and stood. She felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her shoulders. "I just keep thinking, what if we don't get the chance to stop this before it gets worse?" Barack crossed the room and placed his hands gently on her arms. "We will," he said firmly. "But we need to stay calm." Before Michelle could respond, a loud knock echoed through the room. She tensed as Barack moved to open the door. Standing in the hallway were two uniformed security officers, their postures stiff and formal. "Mr. and Mrs. Obama," one of them said, "Captain Andreen requests your presence on the main deck immediately." Michelle's heart sank. She exchanged a quick glance with Barack before straightening her shoulders. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady despite the unease twisting in her gut. The officers escorted them through the ship, their presence drawing curious stares from the few early risers milling about the decks. The main deck, usually bustling with activity, felt eerily empty. At the far end, Captain Andreen stood waiting. His hands were clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. But there was something unsettling about the faint smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "Good morning," he said as they approached. Michelle didn't bother returning the greeting. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice firm. Andreen's smirk widened slightly. "I'm afraid there's been an issue with your conduct on board." Barack's eyes narrowed. "Our conduct?" The captain nodded. "We've received multiple complaints from both staff and passengers regarding your behavior. Disruptive, argumentative, creating a hostile atmosphere. This is not acceptable aboard my ship." Michelle's mouth dropped open in disbelief. "Hostile atmosphere?" she repeated. "You mean standing up for ourselves after being treated like second-class citizens?" Andreen's expression hardened. "I'm not here to debate this, Mrs. Obama. I've made my decision." Barack stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You're making a mistake, Captain. We haven't done anything wrong and you know it." The captain's eyes flickered with something sharp, triumph perhaps, and Michelle felt a chill run down her spine. "I disagree," Andreen said. "And since I am the authority on this vessel, my judgment stands." Michelle clenched her fists. "You can't just kick us off this ship." "Oh, but I can," the captain said smoothly. "For the safety and comfort of my passengers, I have every right to remove disruptive individuals from my ship." Before Michelle could respond, several more uniformed officers appeared behind the captain. Their presence was clearly meant to intimidate. And it worked. "You serious?" Barack said. "As serious as maritime law allows," Andreen replied. And just like that, it was decided. No negotiation, no appeal. And Michelle knew with certainty that they were in far more danger than they had realized. "Captain Andreen requests your presence on the main deck immediately." Michelle's heart sank. She exchanged a quick glance with Barack before straightening her shoulders. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady despite the unease twisting in her gut. The officers escorted them through the ship, their presence drawing curious stares from the few early risers milling about the decks. The main deck, usually bustling with activity, felt eerily empty. At the far end, Captain Andreen stood waiting, his hands clasped behind his back. His expression was unreadable, but the faintest trace of a smirk tugged at the corners of his lips. "Good morning," he said as they approached. Michelle didn't bother returning the greeting. "What's this about?" she asked, her tone firm. Andrine's smirk widened slightly. "I'm afraid there's been an issue with your conduct on board." Barak's eyes narrowed. "Our conduct." The captain nodded. "We've received multiple complaints from both staff and passengers regarding your behavior. Disruptive, argumentative, creating a hostile atmosphere. This is not acceptable aboard my ship." Michelle's mouth dropped open. "Hostile atmosphere," she repeated, incredulous. "You mean standing up for ourselves after being treated like second-class citizens?" Andrine's expression hardened. "I'm not here to debate this, Mrs. Obama. I've made my decision." Barak stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You're making a mistake, Captain. We haven't done anything wrong, and you know it." The captain's eyes flickered with something sharp, triumph perhaps, and Michelle felt a chill run down her spine. "I disagree," Andrine said, "and since I am the authority on this vessel, my judgment stands." Michelle clenched her fists. "You can't just kick us off this ship." "Oh, but I can," the captain said smoothly. "For the safety and comfort of my passengers, I have every right to remove disruptive individuals from my ship." Before Michelle could respond, several more uniformed officers appeared behind the captain. Their presence was clearly meant to intimidate. And it worked. "You're serious," Barak said. "As serious as maritime law allows," Andrine replied. And just like that, it was decided. No negotiation, no appeal. The walk to the lifeboat was the longest of Michelle's life. Guests peered down from balconies and windows, some whispering, others openly gawking. Michelle held her head high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. But inside she burned with fury and humiliation. When they reached the edge of the deck, they were met by a small motorized lifeboat bobbing in the waves below. Inside, supplies had already been stashed: a few bottles of water, protein bars, and a first aid kit. "This is inhumane," Michelle said sharply. "You're leaving us out here like castaways." Captain Andrine stepped closer, lowering his voice so only they could hear. "Consider this a lesson in humility," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Some places simply aren't meant for people like you." Michelle's breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to respond, but Barak gently squeezed her arm, signaling her to hold back. "We'll make it," he said quietly, helping her climb down into the boat. The last thing Michelle saw before the lifeboat pulled away was the captain's smirk as he turned his back on them. The first few hours at sea were a blur. Michelle sat hunched in the cramped space, staring at the endless horizon. The heat was oppressive, and the gentle rocking of the boat quickly became nauseating. Barak busied himself checking the supplies and testing the small radio included in the emergency kit. "It's weak," he muttered, turning the dial. "But I might be able to boost it." Michelle forced herself to focus. "Andrine can't get away with this," she said, her voice raw. "This isn't just negligence, it's calculated. It's personal." Barak nodded. "We'll make sure he doesn't." Hours stretched into evening, the sun dipping below the horizon and bathing the sky in shades of orange and purple. Michelle took turns scanning the horizon with a small pair of binoculars, hoping for any sign of land or a passing ship. Just as despair began to creep in, she spotted something in the distance. A faint outline against the fading light. "Barak," she said urgently, pointing. He looked through the binoculars and exhaled sharply. An island. By the time they reached the shore, darkness had fallen. The boat scraped against the sand, and Barak jumped out first, helping Michelle onto solid ground. They were exhausted, but relief washed over them as they secured the boat and set up a makeshift camp. Michelle's thoughts turned back to Andrine, his smugness, his thinly veiled racism. It fueled her resolve. "We need to find a way to expose him," she said. Barack's expression hardened. "We will." But as the night closed in, they both knew their fight was only just beginning. Hours stretched into the evening and the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the sky in shades of orange and purple. Michelle took turns scanning the horizon with a small pair of binoculars, hoping for any sign of land or a passing ship. Just as despair began to creep in, she spotted something in the distance. A faint outline against the fading light. "Barack," she said urgently, pointing toward the shadowy shape. He quickly took the binoculars from her and exhaled sharply. An island. By the time they reached the shore, darkness had fallen. The boat scraped against the sand and Barack jumped out first, helping Michelle onto solid ground. They were exhausted, but relief washed over them as they secured the boat and set up a makeshift camp. Michelle's thoughts turned back to Andrin. His smugness, his thinly veiled racism, it fueled her resolve. "We need to find a way to expose him," she said, her voice firm. Barack's expression hardened. "We will." But as the night closed in, they both knew their fight was only just beginning. The night passed in uneasy silence. The distant roar of waves crashing against the shore echoed through the darkness as Michelle sat by the small campfire, its flickering light dancing across her face. Barack slept lightly beside her, his arm draped protectively over their meager supplies. Despite the exhaustion weighing heavily on her body, Michelle's mind refused to rest. Images of Captain Andrin's smirking face and their humiliating exile replayed in her thoughts, each memory igniting a fresh wave of anger. The island was remote, a sliver of sand and jungle surrounded by endless water. It was beautiful in its own wild way, but to Michelle it felt like a prison. She stood and began pacing near the shoreline, her footsteps leaving faint imprints in the damp sand. The stars above sparkled like scattered diamonds, but their beauty did little to calm her storming mind. Barack stirred and sat up, his eyes immediately finding her silhouette. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly. She shook her head, crossing her arms against the cool night breeze. "I can't stop thinking about him," she admitted. "And what he's getting away with right now. How many more people like us do you think he's treated this way?" Barack rose and joined her, slipping his arm around her shoulders. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice steady. "We're going to make sure the world knows exactly what happened." They spent the early hours of the morning combing through their supplies and planning their next steps. The emergency kit had included a small waterproof notebook and pen, tools that Michelle immediately began using to document everything they had experienced, from the first uncomfortable glances to the captain's final words before leaving them adrift. "We need evidence," Barack said as he inspected the radio again. "If we can prove what Andrin's been doing, we'll have a chance to expose him." Michelle nodded. "And we need to survive long enough to do it." The day unfolded in a blur of activity. Barack scouted the edges of the island, searching for anything useful while Michelle tended to the fire and rationed their food and water. It wasn't long before Barack returned with a discovery that shifted their focus entirely. Nestled within the jungle, partially buried beneath layers of foliage, was a rusted metal container. The faded logo on its side suggested it had once belonged to the cruise company that owned the Elysium. Inside they found stacks of crates filled with bottled water, canned goods, and most curiously, sealed envelopes and ledgers. Michelle's pulse quickened as she flipped through the documents. "These are manifests," she said, her eyes scanning the pages. "Records of cargo shipments they never declared." Barack leaned over her shoulder, studying the papers. "Smuggling? Looks like it," Michelle replied, pulling out a ledger filled with coded entries. "And judging by how well hidden this is, I'd bet Andrin is involved." The discovery reignited their determination. Over the next several hours, they sifted through the crates, documenting everything they found. Michelle photographed the ledgers and cargo labels using the small waterproof camera included in their kit, preserving the evidence. By evening, they had pieced together a damning narrative, one that tied Captain Andreen and the cruise line to illegal trafficking operations. "This is bigger than we thought," Barack said, setting down the camera. "It's not just racism. It's corruption, exploitation, and now we have proof." Michelle's hands trembled with adrenaline. "But gathering evidence is only the first step," she said. "Getting it out to the world is another challenge entirely." Barack adjusted the dial on the radio, searching for a signal. It crackled faintly, but nothing clear came through. Hours passed, but finally, a faint voice broke through the static. "This is Coastal Patrol, Channel 16, powered by yourself." Relief flooded Michelle's chest. She reached for the radio, but Barack stopped her. "Not yet," he said. She frowned. "What do you mean?" "We can't just call for help and leave it at that," Barack said. "If Andreen intercepts the signal, he'll bury this before it ever gets out. We need to be smart." Michelle hesitated but nodded. "So what do we do?" Barack's eyes darkened with determination. "We send the evidence first." Using the emergency beacon's GPS function, Barack transmitted their coordinates along with the photographs of the documents, encrypting the signal before broadcasting it on multiple frequencies. It was a gamble, but it was the only way to ensure the evidence reached someone before Andreen could cover his tracks. Hours later, as the sun dipped below the horizon again, the radio crackled once more. "Mr. and Mrs. Obama, this is Coastal Patrol. We've received your transmission. Hold your position. Help is on the way." Relief washed over Michelle, but it was short-lived. "Barack," she said, her voice low, "what if they get here and Andreen finds out before they can help us?" Barack's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure we're ready." As night fell once again, Michelle and Barack stayed vigilant, taking turns keeping watch. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows across the sand. It felt like a fragile barrier against the vast darkness pressing in from the jungle and sea. Whatever came next, they had to be ready. "This is it." "I'd bet Andreen's involved," Michelle muttered, flipping through the pages of the ledger. The discovery reignited their determination. Over the next several hours, they carefully sifted through the crates, documenting every piece of evidence they found. Michelle took photographs of the ledgers and cargo labels with the small waterproof camera included in their kit, ensuring the proof was preserved. By evening, they had pieced together a damning narrative, one that tied Captain Andreen and the cruise line to illegal trafficking operations. "This is bigger than we thought," Barack said, setting down the camera. "It's not just racism, it's corruption, exploitation, and now we have proof." Michelle's voice trembled with adrenaline. "But gathering evidence is only the first step. Getting it out to the world is another challenge entirely." The radio crackled faintly as Barack adjusted the dial, searching for any signal. Hours passed, but finally a faint voice broke through the static. "This is Coastal Patrol, Channel 16. Identify yourself." Relief flooded Michelle's chest. She reached for the radio, but Barack stopped her. "Not yet," he said firmly. She frowned. "What do you mean?" "We can't just call for help and leave it at that," Barack said. "If Andreen intercepts the signal, he'll bury this before it ever gets out. We need to be smart." Michelle hesitated but nodded. "So what do we do?" "We send the evidence first." Using the emergency beacon's GPS function, Barack transmitted their coordinates along with the photographs of the documents, encrypting the signal before broadcasting it on multiple frequencies. It was a gamble, but it was the only way to ensure the evidence reached someone before Andreen could cover his track. Hours later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the radio crackled again. "Mr. and Mrs. Obama, this is Coastal Patrol. We've received your transmission. Hold your position. Help is on the way." Relief washed over Michelle, but it was short-lived. "Barack," she said, her voice low, "what if they get here and Andreen finds out before they can help us?" Barack's eyes darkened. "Then we make sure we're ready." As night fell, Michel and Barack stayed vigilant, taking turns keeping watch. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows across the sand. It felt like a fragile barrier against the vast darkness pressing in from the jungle and sea. The first sign of danger came just before dawn, a faint hum vibrating through the air, the unmistakable sound of an approaching motor. Michelle shot up, her heart pounding. "They're coming," she whispered. Barack grabbed the emergency flare gun and stepped toward the shoreline. Moments later, the silhouette of a small boat emerged from the darkness. But it wasn't Coastal Patrol. It was the Elysium's launch boat, and Captain Andreen was standing at the bow. Michelle's breath caught as the captain's voice rang out over the water. "Time's up." A tense standoff followed. Andreen demanded they surrender the evidence, insisting their claims were baseless and would never hold up against his reputation. But Barack stood firm. "You're finished," he said, raising the flare gun. "The world already knows what you've done." The captain's face twisted in anger, but before he could respond, a new sound filled the air. The distant roar of a helicopter. Michelle's heart leapt as the Coastal Patrol's aircraft appeared over the horizon. Andreen's confidence faltered. He turned back toward his crew. "Get us out of here," he barked. But it was too late. A patrol boat arrived moments later, cutting off the launch's escape. Within minutes, Andreen was surrounded and placed under arrest. As the sun rose, Michelle and Barack finally allowed themselves to breathe. They watched as authorities secured the scene, loading the evidence and escorting Andreen and his men away in handcuffs. "This isn't over," Michelle said, staring at the horizon. "No," Barack agreed, "but it's a start." Though the fight wasn't finished, justice was finally beginning to take shape. Softly staring at the horizon, Michelle exhaled deeply. "No," Barack agreed, his gaze steady, "but it's a start." The sun hung low in the sky as Michelle and Barack Obama sat in the shade of a large palm tree on the island's narrow beach. Though the immediate danger had passed and Captain Andreen was in custody, the weight of the past few days still lingered heavily on their shoulders. The rhythmic crash of waves against the shore should have been soothing, but Michelle couldn't shake the tension that gripped her. Even now, as rescue crews secured the scene and collected the crates of evidence, unease settled in her chest. Barack glanced at her, reading the concern in her eyes. "You're thinking about what happens next," he said quietly. Michelle nodded. "It's not over," she replied. "Exposing Andreen and his crimes is just the first step. What about the system that let him operate like this for so long? What about the people who covered for him?" Barack reached for her hand and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "We'll keep pushing," he said firmly. "We've come too far to stop now." The hum of the helicopter that had brought the Coastal Patrol team still echoed in her ears, but Michelle's thoughts kept circling back to the faces of the staff on the Elysium, the fear and helplessness she'd seen in their eyes. People like Lucia, who had risked everything to help them. People who didn't have the same platform or voice that she and Barack did. "They'll need protection," Michelle said suddenly. Barack raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "The staff. People like Lucia. Once this story breaks, there's going to be backlash. The cruise line will throw them under the bus to protect itself." Barack's expression darkened. "You're right," he said, brushing the sand from his pants as he stood. "We need to make sure they're not silenced." The ride back to the mainland was tense. Michelle and Barack sat in the back of the patrol boat, their eyes fixed on the horizon as the island faded into the distance. Across from them, Lucia clutched her small bag, glancing nervously at the officers. "Are you sure this is safe?" she asked quietly. Michelle leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "You're not alone in this, Lucia. We'll make sure you're protected." Lucia's eyes welled with tears. "I never thought anyone would believe me," she said. Barack nodded. "They will now. And not just believe you. They'll listen." When they arrived at the port, reporters were already waiting. News of the rescue had leaked, and camera flashes lit up the dock as Michelle and Barack stepped off the boat. Questions flew at them from all directions, but Barack held up a hand, signaling for calm. "We'll make a statement soon," he said firmly, "but right now, we need to make sure the people who helped us are safe." Lucia kept her head down as they moved through the crowd, but Michelle stayed close, shielding her from the chaos. The days that followed were a blur of press conferences, interviews, and meetings. The evidence they had uncovered, both the documents from the crates and the video recordings Barack had taken, painted a damning picture of corruption and discrimination aboard the Elysium. Andrine's arrest became headline news, sparking outrage and calls for reform across the cruise industry. Michelle watched the coverage unfold with a mix of satisfaction and frustration. The world was paying attention, but she knew how easily stories like this could fade from the public eye. She and Barack spent hours strategizing with advocacy groups and lawyers, determined to keep the pressure on. Meanwhile, Lucia's story took on a life of its own. With Michelle's encouragement, she gave a series of interviews detailing the abuse and discrimination she and other staff members had endured. Her courage resonated with viewers, inspiring others to come forward with their own stories. One evening, as Michelle scrolled through the latest headlines, a notification lit up her phone. A message from Lucia. "They're trying to scare me. I think someone's been following me." Michelle's stomach clenched. She immediately called Barack into the room. "We need to act fast," she said, showing him the message. Barack's jaw tightened. "We'll get her protection," he said. "But this just proves how far they're willing to go to cover this up." They contacted Lucia's lawyer and arranged for security. Michelle also reached out to several journalists, ensuring that any threats against Lucia would be documented and reported. "We're not going to let them intimidate her," Michelle said firmly. The fight was far from over, but this time, the world was watching. The threats against Lucia were documented and reported. "We're not going to let them intimidate her," Michelle said firmly. As the investigation into Andrine and the cruise line deepened, more shocking revelations emerged. Former employees came forward with testimony about years of systemic racism and exploitation. Financial records revealed bribes and cover-ups that implicated not just Andrine, but several high-ranking executives. Michelle and Barack knew they had struck a nerve when the cruise line's lawyers sent a cease and desist letter, accusing them of defamation and threatening legal action. Michelle read the letter twice before handing it to Barack. "They're desperate," she said. Barack nodded. "And scared." Their legal team wasted no time crafting a response, laying out the evidence and daring the company to take them to court. Within days, the cruise line backed down. But Michelle knew the fight was far from over. The real breakthrough came when a whistleblower, one of Andrine's former assistants, provided a recording of a meeting in which executives discussed ways to keep undesirable guests off the Elysium. The language was damning. The recording quickly went viral. Michelle and Barack watched the fallout unfold, feeling a mix of relief and vindication. Executives resigned. Shareholders demanded accountability. Calls for industry-wide reforms gained momentum. But even as the dust began to settle, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that their work wasn't done. "We need to make sure this leads to real change," she said one evening as she and Barack sat on their porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Barack nodded. "We will." A month later, Michelle stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing a packed auditorium. Lucia sat in the front row, flanked by other former staff members from the Elysium. The event had been organized by a coalition of advocacy groups, and the energy in the room was electric. "This isn't just about one ship," Michelle said, her voice steady. "It's about dismantling systems of discrimination and exploitation that have been allowed to thrive in plain sight. It's about making sure no one else has to experience what we did." The crowd erupted in applause. But Michelle's focus remained on Lucia. She saw the pride in the young woman's eyes and knew this was only the beginning. Later that night, As she and Barack sat together, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here, Michelle allowed herself to feel a rare sense of peace. "We did it," she said softly. Barack smiled, pulling her close. "We did. But we're not done yet." Michelle nodded, her resolve firm. "No, not yet." As the night deepened, she found comfort in knowing they would keep fighting. For justice, for equality, and for a better world. The story of Barack and Michelle Obama's ordeal on the Elysium is a powerful lesson in resilience, justice, and the fight against systemic discrimination. It highlights the importance of standing up for oneself, even in the face of adversity. Throughout their journey, they refused to be silenced or intimidated, showing that true strength lies in persistence and strategic action. Their experience teaches us that discrimination, no matter how subtle or overt, should never be ignored. Instead, it must be confronted with evidence, integrity, and determination. Additionally, the story emphasizes the importance of allies, people like Lucia, who risked everything to expose the truth. It reminds us that change is not just about exposing wrongdoing, but also about protecting and uplifting those who have been marginalized. Most importantly, it proves that justice is possible when people refuse to back down, hold those in power accountable, and use their voices to demand lasting change. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Share this video with your friends and leave a comment. We want to know what you think. Check out the other videos on the channel for more inspiring and exciting stories.